So in the early 19th century, evolution was thought about as basically development. Species develop like people or organisms do. So there's birth, there's growth, there's adulthood, and then there's ultimately death. And so the thinking about evolution matches the sort of developmental biology of organisms. Now that is a fairly straightforward idea. You've got one species developing into another, developing into another, developing into another. And the idea is you don't really need to explain it. Development just happens. When people think about evolution before Darwin and Wallace, some big names come to mind. And one is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who's a French zoologist. And Lamarck's idea is about progressive development of organisms. And imagine an escalator or moving stairs, and that's basically Lamarck's idea, that species begin at the bottom of the moving stairs, and then over their long evolutionary history they progress up the stairs and they transform from one to another to another. That transformation is regular and law-like. It's also progressive. It heads in a particular direction. And Lamarck is hugely responsible for encouraging that notion of progressive change, or what we now call evolution. The theory of natural selection is really important in studying evolution because it explains how evolution happens. It helps us predict where evolution might go, and it gives us a rubric for understanding the process itself. Plenty of people before Darwin and Wallace talked about evolution and described what happened, but explaining it is the key. And that's why the natural selection element of evolutionary thinking is so important.
Wallace was suffering probably from malaria and was lying in a small native hut in a village. And suddenly the idea of survival of the fittest occurred to him. Populations tend to increase, food runs out, there'll be some individuals in the population that are fitter, bigger, stronger, whatever, and they'll be the ones who tend to survive and pass on their favourable characteristics to their offspring. And that's how evolution works. When he got back to Ternate, which was a fairly civilized place in a kind of uncivilized region, he wrote a letter and an essay explaining his idea and put it in the post on the next mail ship to none other than Charles Darwin.
The famous question of why Darwin chose to publish when he did. Well, there's no doubt about it that he was faffing about. Darwin was the kind of guy who was a conservative academic. He didn't want to cause a fuss. And the broad approach is to just absolutely 1000% over-determine his argument. And then, of course, when Wallace's work shows up, Darwin is kicked up the backside, I think is the easiest way to say it, and is told in no uncertain terms, you've got to get on with this and get it done. And there's an absolute rush to get things published, and there's no doubt about it, the Wallace correspondence inspired Darwin, but there's an awful lot of activity beforehand. The initial reaction to The Origin is really very dull. You got to ask yourself, who is the audience for The Origin and who's the audience for evolutionary thinking? And this is where I think Wallace comes in very important ways, that Darwin is very happy to talk only to highly specialized scientists and carry out the technical conversation. The origin of species is an argument that takes place in public as well as amongst the professionals. And the public goes crazy over ideas about natural selection. No one cares about the evolution of sponges, and no one cares about the evolution of giraffes. What everybody in the popular world worried about was the origin of, well, us, humans. Where do humans come from? And Darwin was extremely quiet on that point, to the point of massive frustration. But lots of other people got into the argument, Wallace included. And Wallace played an important part of that conversation. He represented a very common view when it came to human evolution, that the animal world evolved in the way that it does, and the human body may have evolved the way it may have evolved from animals, but the human mind, the humanity, the things that make us special, that requires something more. And Wallace is a very interesting person to look at from that perspective, because he represents the majority opinion, and the conversation in the public about the reception to the origin of species and to the reception of evolutionary ideas. It's all about humans, and Wallace is right there in the middle of that conversation. So one of the legends in the thinking about the reception of the origin of species and evolutionary ideas is a so-called debate that takes place in Oxford in 1860 at the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. On the one side is T.H. Huxley, Darwin's so-called bulldog, and on the other side is Sam Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford. And it's remembered, it's retold as a story of science versus religion. But what it really seems to be is it's two fellas fighting it out in the playground, basically. Really what it boils down to is about human dignity. And if you think about evolution and you promote the evolutionary ideas, Sam Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, thought that you dehumanized humanity. And he didn't like that, and he argued about it. They weren't really talking about the technical bits of evolutionary theory. What they were talking about was its implication for humanity. What happened at the time natural selection was proposed was the academic scientists debated it really hard. And they thought it worked, but only in a much more limited way than Darwin and Wallace did. And they both were really pushed hard to convince colleagues that what they saw in the world as a whole was actually going on. In the long term, natural selection was in for a rough ride across the 19th century, and it just didn't look like it was capable of causing the kind of evolutionary change, and lots of other processes were suggested to replace it. Natural selection gets a revival in the early 20th century, where with new thinking about genetics and Mendelism, it seems like, yes, you actually can get the amount of change in the amount of time you've got available. And then across the 20th century, all sorts of models and experiments and new natural history work is done, and it demonstrates quite conclusively that natural selection drives evolution. These days, natural selection is seen to be a powerful element in evolutionary theory. Lots of other things take place in evolution too. People haven't been asleep for 75, 100 years, just riding on the back of natural selection. But natural selection is an important element in the overall picture of modern evolutionary biology. It's really easy to relate the modern studies of genomics, like the Human Genome Project, back to thinking about natural selection, Darwin and Wallace. And the folks who study the human genome now find extraordinary diversity in the genome, not just in different communities or ethnic communities, but within single ethnic communities, massive diversity. And one question is, why is all that diversity there? If natural selection is so strong and powerful, why does it allow so much, not really junk, but why so much variety? How strong is natural selection? How powerful is it? How persistent is it? Those are questions that thrive in modern thinking about the Human Genome Project.